Oh,
Okay, let's get going.
never mind, that you are.
I'm going to take half the class here, so in no ways will I go beyond 2:50. And then Professor Knott will finish up some work he's doing last time. I will take the full hour on Wednesday. And the topic we're doing right now is where does the fuel come from? We're actually going to talk a little bit about the fuel cycle, actually the front end of the fuel cycle. And then talk about the very important topics about separation, uranium separation, enrichment, and then there'll be the topic on plutonium reprocessing. Since the last time I took an honors course in chemistry in high school, will be done by a real pro, Professor Rebecca Abergel of our department, who will be talking to us for half the lecture on April the 10th. One little coda from last week's lecture. So we got a fascinating discussion, like where was this seismograph that Edward Teller was looking at on Halloween in 1952? Actually, it was already November 1st in the South Pacific, where the Ivy Mike shot took place. And an aerodrogram that was actually at Haviland Hall. So for those of you who know, mostly are familiar with the North Campus side. Here's Euclid, here's Hearst. You cross over there, that's called Northgate. There's like an esplanade. You see O'Brien, you see the beautiful Doe Library ahead of you. Just as you go over the embankment, actually you can't quite see it. You go down the embankment, there's one of these beautiful old iconic Berkeley buildings, John Yale and Howard Tate buildings, and that's Haviland Hall. Right now it's occupied by social scientists, but I kind of nosed around there, found the basement, went down to the basement, walked down the stairs, and then there's a single door that says Seismograph Laboratory, written in very old paint. It was locked. So I then repaired up to O'Brien Hall, which is Earth and Planetary Sciences, glad-handed my way past a few doors. And then found out that the director of the seismology program, Richard Allen, was on sabbatical at Harvard. But I sent him an email, and I sent him the YouTube link. And he sent me back an enthusiastic email that says, I had no idea about this. And he said, but then his operations manager, who he put me in contact with, a person by the name of Peggy Hellwig, said, oh yes, of course. It was down in Haviland Hall. We still got the old machinery and all this kind of stuff. And sometime this week, I'm going to go down there with my cell phone camera, take some pictures, and regale you with this. But he was delighted because he's actually teaching a course this fall where he actually wants to bring in some of these historical and human interest stories. Anyway, where does the fuel come from? Here was the challenge. In the early 1940s, the world's supply of plutonium, now owned, and we have it here on the Berkeley campus, was something about the size of a fleck of pepper, a little flake of pepper, micrograms of plutonium. The world's supply of separated 235 was a little smudge on metal foil. The challenge on the time scale of 3 years was to all of a sudden be producing hundreds of kilograms of both of these things per year. That was a challenge. Okay. So we talked about enrichment. Uranium-235 is a sub-percentage fraction of natural uranium and requires enrichment. How to separate it out and because to make, as we did the math the other day, a bomb critical reaction, prompt critical reaction requires that we get that number up to 90% or higher. It can be lower, but if you want to make the thing as compact as possible, the requirement of only some tens of kilograms, it really does need to be 90%. Plutonium doesn't exist naturally. You make it in a reactor. As a byproduct of natural reactor operation. That's reprocessing, and that's what Professor Abergel will be telling us about. Let's talk about uranium. And there's some interesting things about uranium and where it comes from. There's a lot of it on Earth. And interestingly, you might not guess, the people, there's many paradoxes about the thing here. The people who make heavy use of it are not necessarily the people who own the reserves naturally. US has a major program, China has a large emerging program, but we just have a few percent of the world's supply. Australia does not have any power reactors. They have a research reactor, but they are by far, by factors of 2.5, the largest owners of reserves. Kazakhstan is big, Canada is big, those are your biggies, and Russia itself is doing very well. During the Second World War, when it was first appreciated the possibility of making a bomb of enriched uranium-235, the Germans all of a sudden became very interested in mining uranium, securing uranium reserves in Africa at the time. Now, oh, by the way, forever and ever, people have known that there's just lots of uranium in seawater. Not at the fraction percent level as in food or as here, but it's at the part per billion level. But people said, well, it's way too expensive to develop a chemical process to extract it from seawater. In fact, as we speak, people are making headway at the Pacific PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Lab, and university partners have begun to develop a process that may make this thing feasible. In which case, that would really change, in many ways, the whole, sort of like what fracking did to OPEC. And the same, this could put on its head the whole international market for uranium. Now, the interesting thing is, the first 3 countries there are very, very friendly to the United States. But one of the paradoxes of uranium is the people who have it are not necessarily the people, or the production is not necessarily proportional to how much people have. Now, Kazakhstan, in fact, makes a lot. Canada, which has a lot, in fact, or Australia, which has the most, is sizable but not dominant. Canada and Kazakhstan are quite large. Mm-hmm. Now, the other paradox is you might say, well, we're going to be in good shape because the people who make it are our friends. But the other thing is it's not necessarily the case that the people who are our friends sell it to us. And it's not because they don't like us, it's just that that uranium is actually tied up in long-term contracts. And the people who have actually tied up a lot of the uranium contracts, particularly from Canada, our neighbors to the north, in fact, the Russians and the Chinese. So they're actually sending, these contracts turn over from time to time to China, but Canada is sending a lot of their uranium both to Russia and China. Russia, of course, and China both have great aspirations to be exporters of nuclear technology. I think our own aspirations for exporting nuclear technology to other countries is a little bit lukewarm right now, as we're also in kind of a period of introspection about what nuclear power is going to be like in our own country. But anyway, it's formed in a form called yellow cake. It's say that for me, Chelsea. That's anyway, I'm not against. Here are the 4 ways of enriching uranium. Uranium oxide. Okay. The one thing that was discovered that in the Second World War, during the Manhattan Project, is that the way you would need to deal with uranium to efficiently enrich it would require turning it into a gas burst. And by bad luck, the only gas you could make of it is just extremely corrosive. It was uranium hexafluoride. And so it has one nice feature, as you'll see shortly, and that is that fluorine only has one stable isotope. You're not dealing with something that's going to have a mixed atomic weight. And part of the challenge in the Manhattan Project is this actually drove everything had to happen on a crash program basis, entirely new chemistries. They had to develop new gaskets, new oils, new metallic parts that would not be eaten up almost instantly by this extremely corrosive gas. So often the best chemists, the best material scientists in the world have got pressed into service and had to create a whole new way of making these, where basically going to be large chemical plants that would stay together and not be corroded and eaten inside out. So we had to deal with this stuff on a large basis, and required this entirely new chemistry and material science to deal with this corrosive gas. Now, the first two in today's talk, I'm going to deal just with the first two. And then I'm going to talk about these two on Wednesday before we get into the issue of nuclear weapons effects. These are the two methods that were used to separate uranium or to enrich uranium during the Manhattan Project. So let's talk about gaseous diffusion. If you're going to separate uranium-235 from uranium-238, it's kind of an obvious thing that what you're going to be looking for are anything in the world of physical science where you see a mass-dependent behavior, which will give you a handle on some way to separate the 235 and 238. And all four of these do. So the first is gaseous diffusion, which was the workhorse in the Second World War. And it has to do with the fact, we'll look at this in just a second here, but what this thing looks like from a process point of view is you're going to put in a feed stream with the UF6 here, a high pressure gas, and you're going to have a semi-permeable membrane here, cylindrical membrane, that is, again, going to withstand this very corrosive material. And some sintered metal, sintered nickel or sintered aluminum, with pore sizes on the order of a few nanometers, tens of nanometers or so, which is several mean-free paths of the gas at the pressure that it was used. And the lighter gas here, the diffusion coefficient is inversely proportional to the square root of the mass. You say, why is this the square root? Well, ultimately, this thing goes like the velocity times the mean free path. Velocity goes like the square root of the energy divided by the mass, and that's why you have the inverse square root of the mass difference here. So here's the challenge. So if I put a pressure against this membrane, you'll find that ever so slightly more of the 235 versus the 238 will emerge on the other side of this sintered barrier. So the gas, UF6, the atomic weight is 349. For 238, it's 352. Very small difference, and when you take the square root, that difference becomes a little bit smaller. So you're really looking at 4 parts per thousand difference in the diffusion coefficient. From a yield and optimization point of view, in this device back here, you want half the mass of this gas here to go through the barrier, and half to pass through the output, the depleted stream. In one sense, that's kind of obvious. If nothing flows through, what goes down here is unseparated. If you force all of the gas through here, you're not separated at all. But if you simply do kind of a max-min problem, you actually find that the optimized mass, the enriched mass yield, is optimized when about 50% goes through the barrier like that. These kinds of tricks are interesting. My uncle, years ago, actually, when he was in hospice care, had one of these little home units about this big that makes oxygen. And I'd never thought about this before, unless you've actually had a family member or a friend who's actually had to have oxygen. When they walk around or get on an airplane, they usually have a little tank with them. But if they're at home, there's this thing here which actually produces oxygen. And the same kind of thing happens there. You actually hear this thing. What's going on is that you're actually forcing ordinary air through basically zeolite, which is a cage-like crystal. And when you all of a sudden push rapidly, you put a pressure differential there. The atoms which preferentially hop into the little cage-like molecules are the nitrogen. And then you quickly discharge, and what gets discharged is almost pure oxygen. Then you put a vacuum on it, the nitrogen comes out, you flush it out, and then you repeat the cycle. So you put a pressure differential there, the nitrogen preferentially goes into the zeolite, the oxygen goes out, and then you put a vacuum on it. And so this is why you hear these machines going. So that's actually a cyclic thing. But many things in life, in the industrial world, use this kind of differential gaseous diffusion to operate. Now, okay, so we looked at this. So when you actually...
Here's a question.
Was the principle of isotope separation by gases diffusion developed during that project or previous?
No, it's actually, it was known long before that, but on an industrial scale, there was a patent from 1940. The principle was known, I think, back, probably at the time of, I'm not saying John Dalton or anything like that, but the differential diffusion coefficients was actually classical physics right after the 19th century. At an industrial scale, when it became actually useful to separate isotopes, that I think there's an important British patent, I think, dating from 1940, and I'll find that out for you. Now, given that, as I say, you optimize the mass yield by having only half the gas go through the membrane, and the fact that nothing acts in a perfectly ideal way, in reality, a typical enrichment stage per stage is like 1 part in 1,000. Now you can say, oh, this is a fool's errand, give up. But it suggests a cascade like the following. So if you just line up many of these things in a row, where you put in fuel here, have roughly half of it come out here, and this is P stands for product, and W stands for waste. And then you have another pump here, because you have to put pressure on this thing to make it work. You come in here, again, now you have slightly enriched multiplied by another 1.001, and little by little you can build up the enrichment like this. Now, I think some of you here are chemical engineers. Didn't we have any chemical engineers in here? Right. What do you think about this?
Yeah, that's how it works.
Okay, actually no. But you're right, but this is actually, in its simplest state, and I've drawn it here, this is a very bad idea. And the reason is the following. The enrichment per stage is so low, you can just do a simple calculation. If I'm throwing away basically half my material into waste at every stage, and I have to have some incredible number of stages, to produce 1 kilogram of uranium-235 back here, relatively pure, would require an ungodly amount of fuel inside here. So in fact, this is actually, as simple as it looks, at this level of simplicity, it's a bad idea. So what you now get into is basically called a farm. So what you need to do is produce what's called a farm or a cascade. Remember, the stuff that you just put into the waste stream still has essentially as much 235 in it as the stuff that you call the product. So the answer is, give it another chance. Make it come by and make it do another lap and give it another chance to get the 235 out. This is the simplest kind of cascade. This, by the way, when we talk about centrifuges, it's going to be essentially the same game. Centrifuges are hugely important today, and I have a paper up by Scott Kemp of MIT, because it is now the enrichment scheme of choice for rogue nations who do not want to abide by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and something that you need to watch out for in terms of proliferance, because it's something that can be readily concealed, and you do need to worry about whether people have secret enrichment stations, enrichment facilities going on. So you feed the material in here, and here is your first cascade. Product goes this way, let's see, yeah, product goes this way, feed goes in here. If it passes through the membrane, it goes here. If it passes through and it doesn't go through the membrane, then it comes back here, but then it goes back into the feed stream. So the product comes out, goes through a second one. If it succeeds there, if it goes through the membrane, it goes here and up, but if not, it goes back into the feed stream. So everybody gets multiple chances to make it, and then what ultimately comes out the right end of the cascade is called product, and finally, somewhere downstream here is the stuff that will be significantly depleted of uranium. Now, our department lives on the floor. We share the fourth floor of Echeverry with the IELR department, Industrial Engineering Operations Research. Operations research people are basically mathematicians. Okay, they love this stuff. They're applied mathematicians. Optimization is everything they do. This is the issue about how you design an optimized cascade to maximize the enrichment of the product here, minimize the waste, and minimize the capital investment is just a classic problem that these guys just groove on, rising out. They just love this stuff. But it's easy to show that the number of stages here's the number that goes like 1.001 to the nth power, goes like, and then here you actually get to decide what you want. You say, I want to make the cascade big enough such that this number turns out to be above 90%. And I also want to put enough of these, this is sort of like being in grammar school, being sent back 2 grades for remedial education. You keep giving it a chance to pass and make it up into the enrichment stream here. Let's say I want the waste fraction to be only not 0.7%, but for example, 0.4%. I can drive this lower and lower and lower by larger capital investment on the downstream side of this thing. And then you can calculate how many stages you need in your cascade. Then it turns out, if you want to get weapons grade uranium, it's like 4,000 of these little units. You might say that's crazy. Well, I'm going to show you in a minute. So as I say, the operations research people went wild on this, and you have all kinds of cascades. But when you think about it, the one that actually really represents the mathematically optimized cascade kind of looks like it's kind of a teardrop shape. And this stands to reason each of these units can only take a certain mass flow per second. Where the feed-in is, these are the ones that are going to see the largest amount of material right here. As the material gets more and more refined, I mean, think about it. If I'm taking in a kilogram, or well, put it this way, if I'm taking 100 kilograms of uranium at the feed, if I make pure uranium on the downstream, that's only half a kilogram. So clearly, I need fewer units. The more and more pure it gets, I need fewer and fewer units. On the waste end, I need more. And at some point, you decide you're going to give up and just throw this stuff out. And this is called the tail right there. So this is what happens when you let the OR people go wild. And you actually get something where you minimize your capital investment and you maximize your output. Now, we're in a war. The country says, cost is no object. Spend as much as you want, fast, make us a bomb. And what you got was something that was just staggering. Niels Bohr made a comment at the beginning of the war after he had actually fled Europe, and he said, you could not build a bomb without turning the country into a giant factory. At the end of the war, he got a tour of the United States, and they said, actually, you built the bomb. And he looked at it and he says, I was right. You turned the entire country into a factory. This is the K-25 plant in Oak Ridge. It's one of 3 gaseous diffusion plants we have. This building is a mile long. A mile long. And there's 2 of them, and then there's a unit right here. And it took 3 gigawatts of power. And you put it in Tennessee because, why did we put these things in Oak Ridge, Tennessee? Yeah, Tennessee Valley Authority, an infinite amount of hydroelectric electricity. I mean, there's just more electricity than you can use. This is like 3 cities worth of electric power. And for this, you put it in Oak Ridge, you don't even, you just do it. Pictures from the war make the thing. And every picture you see from Oak Ridge in the war are just these rotting old buildings and people wading around in mud up to their ankles. So it's not a pretty sight. Now they just moved on. Here's one in the Portsmouth plant in Ohio. That one is not only a mile long, but in fact, it actually is a square mile of nothing but building. Okay, the overall thing is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres. These things are massive. They're incredibly expensive. And by 20 years ago or so, all the gaseous diffusion plants in the US have been shut down. Up until the Cold War, we'll talk about this later on, the complex of DOE plants was amazing. The number of places across the entire state, the United States, where you had reactors, you had gaseous diffusion plants, everything there. You had places that made did all kinds of chemical processes, made electromechanical parts, and now that has really collapsed down to a much, much, much smaller footprint. Let's talk about electromagnetic separation, unless there's a question. A few lectures ago, we talked about Near's spectrometer. There's Alfred Near, who was a pioneer in making mass specs. And I showed you this picture before. And this thing is curved like this in a semicircle, because what he's going to do is put that in a magnet, make ions, and then the ions are going to travel in a perfectly semicircular arc like that. And as we'll just review in just a second, this is another physical process where the radius of curvature is mass dependent. A very slight difference in mass will give you a difference in the radius of curvature. And up here, he actually was able to see 2 little smudges, a little line here and a little line there, which represented the 238 ions hitting up here and the 235 ions hitting down there. So here's the physics, and it's nothing more than that. If I take parallel plates, for example, this is at ground, and this one's I put a potential V. I put it, if these are positive ions, I singly ionize the uranium here. I put this one at a negative potential of like negative 1,000 volts. Then it accelerates here. Whether you're 235 or 238, you have the same energy here. So the energy is simply the voltage times the charge. But the momentum, because remember the kinetic energy is p squared over 2m. So I just solved for that, and I solved that P equals 2m times the kinetic energy, square root. I'll subscript it with I. The heavier species will have a slightly higher momentum. The lighter species has a slightly lower momentum, but they still have the same kinetic energy. And Lorentz force law, the momentum over the charge it equals the magnetic field times the radius of curvature. So the radius of curvature is directly proportional to the momentum. So this immediately suggests what you want to do. If I make a very small version, I get a spectrometer. If you were a visionary like Lorentz, you all of a sudden realize you can make what was called the Calutron, and Cal stands for California. So this was the second way of building and doing separation, which was the electromagnetic separation. And this sketch looks exactly like the sketch before. Simple in principle, it was a bear in actual implementation for lots and lots and lots of reasons. Now, don't be deceived here. You might say, oh, this looks easy. There's the 238 ions and here's the 235 ions. In fact, what they're depicting is that each of them comes out in a spray, and those two sprays are overlapping. And one needs to design this thing in a very careful way such that you have slightly more of the stuff that you want, the 235 on the inner track, but still it's heavily contaminated with 238. And then the stuff that you try to keep out of the collector is mostly 238, but you're also going to have some 235 there too. So it too is not going to be very efficient. History. Now, when you come up University Avenue on a nice day, you look up on the hill and you see this beautiful iconic building. Now, the building was kept as a historical landmark. The 184-inch cyclotron was dismantled when I was still working when I was a postdoc here a long time ago. But sometime in the late 1980s, I think they tore it down. And they used this nice building to house this shiny new third-generation light source. But they kept this thing because it's actually a historical landmark and it's actually kind of pretty. Are into this kind of thing. But that's the thing you see when you come up University Avenue. You actually can see it on the side of the hill. Lawrence built it before the war. He started this construction because he was an expansive guy and he was thinking about, the cyclotrons went from 5 inches in diameter to this monster in very few years, and they were doing all kinds of exciting physics. That's what the cyclotron looked like. When the war started and the Manhattan Project kicked into high gear, they basically hijacked this cyclotron to test the principle of the Calutron. And it worked, it seemed to work, and all of a sudden the country was now involved with building a massive plant in Oak Ridge. The first one was called the Alpha Calutron. There is one section of it. The thing that Alfred Lear could hold in one hand and weighed probably half a pound was now a massive section like this. And this is what the entire Alpha Calutron racetrack looked like. And then this was the beta. This one was a mess. It didn't function very well. It was breaking down. They were learning how to improve it on the fly, and it was very wasteful. In fact, I think for only 1 out of every 6,000 atoms that they ever pushed into this thing ever came out as usable fuel. But it kind of worked. And what General Leslie Groves figured out is the first thing you need to do to make this thing work successfully is you have to kick out physicists. So when they actually went to operate this thing, every physicist, PhD physicist, wanted to control the knobs, and they were trying to maximize the current on this voltmeter and minimize this. And he actually found out that, who the best people to make this thing work were? It was local young women from the Oak Ridge region that were actually called, that are known today as the Calutron girls. They actually had much better skill at making this work than the PhD physicists. They wanted to know what they were doing, and they told, no, what you're doing is very important for national security, but you don't know why you're maximizing this needle and minimizing this needle over here. They found out after the war. The summary of the EM separation program was a difficult technology. They were breaking down all the time. Alpha machine was only partially successful. The beta actually got working very well, and by the end of the war had produced our 95% uranium and then started producing this stuff regularly every month. Interestingly, the gaseous diffusion plant and the calutrons worked kind of in tandem to actualize make up for one another's weaknesses. So the Alpha machine was able to get stuff up to 12 or 14%. They sent to Los Alamos for physics experiments, but it was going to struggle to actually make 90% stuff. But they actually could take the stuff out of the Alpha plant at 15%, put it in the gaseous diffusion plant, it would get it up to some 40%, and then that actually at some later time was put into the beta machine, which got it up to 95%. So there's trading off of inventories between the gaseous diffusion plants and the calutrons. Ultimately, they got us there. This was a terrible mess for the people who worked there. you know, you would shoot this uranium out of the source. It turns out it was just getting caked up and splattered all over the machine, and these guys had to go in and scrape it off, resmelt it, and put it back in again, because this uranium stuff is very special, it's very expensive and precious. The whole program cost $9 billion in today's money. It was a very significant fraction of the entire Manhattan Project. And this is the interesting thing. You want to use copper for coils because it's most efficient. Turns out the country had taken all the copper off the market because they went to using casing for artillery shells. In fact, if you're coin collectors, 1941 to 1945, the Lincoln's head penny were called steelies. Michael and I remember this. So they did not have copper in them. And that's because all the copper that normally went into pennies went into making artillery shells. So the Manhattan Project went to Fort Knox and put basically a warrant in hand and said, we need every ounce of silver in the U.S. inventory. And they signed over this receipt, this invoice. They gave them 14,000 tons of silver to make into wire, which is very good conductivity, essentially as good as copper. At the end of the war, they returned every ounce of it to the National Repository at Fort Knox. Even very careful where they had to solder things on and file things off, they collected the filings in the machine shops, and they swept up every crumb in the machine shop, separated the silver to make sure we did good by the national, by the National League. But it was a crash program that worked. Now you might say, well, this was such a disaster, we'll never see the electromagnetic separation program again, ever. Surprise, and my timing will be perfect. My boss who hired me at Livermore years ago, is a kind of a Boolean Texan by the name Jay Davis. He's a brilliant and slightly crazy guy, but he was an excellent, a really wonderful physicist. He actually was basically, I don't know if he volunteered or was somebody suggested, he became part of what's called UNSCOM Team 4, the UN Special Commission, to go in after Gulf War I to inspect, to see if Iraq had been running a clandestine WMD program, whether it be nuclear, chemical, or biological. And the Iraqis said, we're then a defeated nation, said, no, we have none of these things here. So they actually went in and they said, we want to see this plant here and we want to see this plant there. And then all of a sudden, we knew something was up because satellites began to see when certain of these factories were being bombed during the war, that hundreds of troops were actually dragging out and putting on material onto trucks and then driving them. They said, my gosh, that's interesting, what's going on there? So they came to inspect some of these facilities, and Revolutionary Guard actually held these guys hostage in a parking lot for 4 days. They refused to let them move or maneuver. This guy is from the UK, David Kay. This thing here is actually a satellite telephone, mobile phone. So he was actually able to talk back to Washington and say what was going on. And so they knew that, in fact, this sort of diplomatic thing was going on. Jay Davis went up on a water tower and actually saw convoys of trucks going away. They called back, and then these trucks were intercepted some 30 miles later, and they actually started finding some stuff. And the Iraqis kept saying, no program. Finally, they got a defector to start talking about it and said, yeah, we had a big program, and we were doing electromagnetic separation. And then all of a sudden, they started finding boxes and boxes and hundreds of boxes of documents and files and blueprints and so forth. And then they started unearthing things that the Iraqis had hastily buried, including calutrons. Now, why did the Iraqis pick electromagnetic separation? Right? Yes. All of these things, by the way, I'll give you a hint, are electricity hungry. They bury the power lines such that the satellites couldn't see them. So we went for years and years and years not knowing. I think Professor Knott probably knows these stories, will give us a better rendition of it later on. They hid the program for us because they buried power lines. The first thing your spy satellites look for is, why are they running megawatts of power out here to a cornfield? And it's immediate suspicion that there's some nefarious activity going on. It was really interesting. Jay calls it his Indiana Jones days. There was actually a Physics Today article from July of 1992 I'm going to put on where he and David Kay talk about their days in Iraq. There's the transformer building, one of two of them at the Tamia and then Al Sharqat was the other place where they were doing electromagnetic separation. And here's a photograph of the trucks going away. Jay went up a water tower, was looking around with binoculars, and then saw these trucks zooming away. He took some pictures, and then they called up to Washington through the satellite mobile phone, and then these guys were intercepted, and they finally the Iraqis spilled the beans. So, and Jay came back and he said, this was good work. This was really a high quality program, much better than we did in World War II. But of course, nowadays they had microprocessors and fiber optics and all kinds of stuff, so they could actually make an enrichment program work much better than we did. With that, I'm going to stop. Any questions? We'll talk a little bit more next time, principally about the centrifuge and a little bit more about the numbers of enrichment, because this is where things get dicey when you start figuring out how quick could a nation sprint to getting their first kilograms of uranium to make a bomb. And the numbers are a little bit non-intuitive.
Thank you very much, Carl. So I'm going to pick up where I left off last time on proliferation. And get through these slides that I have prepared. Going back to the French for a second. So I sent out a message to you that I had mischaracterized the number of nuclear weapons in the French stockpile as 300, not a few thousand. So that means that the French, the British, the Chinese are all within the same ballpark today, based on current U.S. knowledge. I'll move on beyond France. We talk a little about the Chinese program. And by the way, I think these days, as President Weber said earlier, gas centrifuge is the option of choice for acquiring weapons-grade material. It's not true everywhere, but it's true in most places. The Chinese, in particular, were aided by the Russians early on in their program, and then built up a stockpile that could be spread among air, sea, and land-based systems. So they were sort of emulating the U.S. triumph. But they have, next slide. They have large numbers of mobile systems. They have hardened, deeply buried targets underground. So the actual numbers, there's a confidence interval around those numbers. I think I mentioned, I remember last time, a lot more about Xinjiang and Western China. And they do have this declaratory no first use pledge, but that's a pledge, and that can change in a moment in times of war. So now, Uh, with 5 nuclear weapon states already established, momentum developed in the 60s to try to stop the process. And each country, each of the 5, basically said, we're a nuclear weapon state, we don't want any more nuclear weapon states. So it was not exactly an egalitarian attitude. So the US and the Soviet Union and the British and the French and the Chinese felt if there was any way to stop the spread, that would be good. The basic concept is that the more nuclear weapons there are, the more likely that they'll be used, the more likely they'll be used, the more terrible will be the results. Move on to the next. So the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, was signed in 1968. As I mentioned, in the US, you have to go through the Senate confirmation process. It took almost 2 years. And every country has its own ratification process. And the NPT entered into force in 1970. And it did call for the establishment of an International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, which would be in the business of assisting all the signatories to the treaty who are not nuclear weapon states in developing nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. And I mentioned one of our former students who just left here recently, Sarah Lederman, MIT undergrad, master's in information engineering, master's in public policy. She's now in IAEA in the Safeguards Division. And we're going to try to get George Moore here, who spent a number of years in a senior position in Safeguards. So he'll give you a lot of flavor about how it actually works. Of course, the US does not solely rely on the IAEA for verification. We have our own so-called National Technical Means, or NTM, to determine that other countries are abiding by the treaty. This uses satellite imaging, it uses electronic intercepts, it uses human resources, the whole panoply of American intelligence capabilities. So the IAEA safeguards effort is a supplement in the US case to all the information that the US has collected. The 5 nuclear weapon states are prohibited from assisting anybody else to acquire nuclear weapons. So we believe, for the most part, Soviet assistance to the Chinese stopped before they entered the NPT. And as you'll see in a minute, the French assistance to the Israelis also stopped before the French joined the NPT. And since almost all countries at least want the theoretical option to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, they had an incentive to sign the treaty. You know, they had no interest in nuclear weapons. So that's why 190 states, and that's almost every country in the world, is a party to the NPT. You got these 3 states, Israel, India, Pakistan, that never signed the treaty. North Korea signed it, but then withdrew. In every international treaty, there's a withdrawal clause, usually with 6 months' notice. You say, and usually has language to the effect of the National Security Act. If there are new developments that threaten the national security of the state, you have the right to withdraw from the treaty. Iran has been a part of the treaty despite its ongoing efforts to acquire nuclear weapons. We'll talk more about Iran probably in a separate session. Israel. So Israel is a special case in a number of ways. First, it's the only nuclear weapon state that never tested. Every other state has tested nuclear weapons. How do we know that they have nuclear weapons? Again, through NTM and other means. But the Israelis have never denied they have nuclear weapons. And the former Prime Minister of Israel said, we will not be the first in the Middle East to have nuclear weapons, nor will we be the second. They have a big plant in Dimona, which was designed and built in part by the French. The French were major aides to Israel in the 1950s until de Gaulle became president in 58. De Gaulle was not a big fan of Israel and wanted France to tilt much more to the Arab states for oil and other reasons. You may not know much about Israel, maybe you do. It was established in 1948 as a consequence of the Holocaust in Europe. There's an interesting anecdote where the U.S. had to make a decision whether to recognize Israel. Truman was president, and he convened a meeting of his top advisors, and every top advisor, led by General Marshall, said it is not in the American interest to recognize Israel because it will alienate the Arab states, and they have the oil, and we need good relations with the Arab states for U.S. national interests. It went around the table, everybody opposed U.S. recognition of Israel. The last person was a young aide to Truman named Clark Clifford, who was a very famous Washington lawyer, who later served briefly as Secretary of Defense after McNamara was fired over Vietnam in 1968. And Clifford, who was the age of Marshall's son, said, no, I don't agree with all of you folks. There's a moral imperative here, given what happened during the war, that the Jews have a right to have a state of their own. And Truman recessed the meeting. Truman had been in business. His failed hat shop, his haberdashery shop in Kansas City, was with a Jewish man named Jacobson. And he was sort of neutral about Jews, didn't care one way or the other. His wife was quite anti-Semitic and refused to ever let Jacobson come into their house for dinner. So Truman was torn about all this, but ultimately he sided with Clifford and against Marshall and all of the other top people. So the U.S. recognized Israel as a Jewish state, and that was important, gave it legitimacy. Although the instant that the Jewish state was announced, they were attacked by several Arab states. That was the first Arab-Israeli war. And it was a fight for survival. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, I think, all attacked Israel. So in the early, that was in 48, in the early 50s already, the founding Prime Minister of Israel, Ben Gurion, said we need nuclear weapons for state survival. So the beginnings of their program go back to the early 50s. There was one peculiar incident in the late 70s called the Vela satellite. So the U.S. has lots of very sophisticated satellites, and one of our satellites picked up a flash of what could have been a nuclear weapons test. And this is when Jimmy Carter was president. And he, it would be very important if Israel detonated a nuclear device. Even though they haven't signed the NPT, that would be an important new step. It turned out there was some intelligence that the Israelis had been collaborating with the South Africans, which was a non-nuclear state, signed the NPT, but seemed to be growing a nuclear weapons program. And it remains unresolved because Carter had two senior people, one in the Defense Department and his science advisor, a man named Frank Press from MIT, Carl knows. And they each did an independent study of all the Vela satellite data, and they came to opposite conclusions. One Press said, no, it was meteor or some flash from outer space? And the Defense Department said, no, it was a nuclear test. So Carter never blamed the Israelis, never accused them of anything. The Israelis never said anything about it. But in the meantime, we know through our own intelligence and partly through guesstimates that they now have a substantial nuclear stockpile. See the huge uncertainty in the range of what is that they have. But the peculiar characteristic of Israel, it says in part more the others, is that there's no confirmed test, and they consider it a nuclear weapon state. Then India, of course, India and Pakistan were both established in 1947, when the British Empire was being carved up into independent states. And this is, of course, very relevant right today, what's going on there. One area, Kashmir, was a Muslim-dominated territory that India claimed. And India and Pakistan have never agreed since 1947 until this afternoon on who controls Kashmir. India went through several transitions in leadership, and in 1971, I think it might have been when Indira Gandhi was prime minister, I'm not sure, I forgot. They detonated a device inside India, right on the edge of the Pakistan border. So, Pakistani said, it's threatening nuclear war with us. He said, no, we're just testing a peaceful nuclear explosion, PNE. It can change river directions, it can move mountains around, do a lot of it. So this clearly showed an Indian capability in 1971, but they never said anything, they never declared themselves a nuclear weapon state. The Pakistani prime minister at the time was Ali Bhutto, whose daughter later also became prime minister, who I actually taught in a class on this subject at Harvard. She was a student in the early 1980s. Ali Bhutto himself initiated the work on the Pakistani nuclear program to counter the Indian program. The Indians during the Cold War had been closely allied with the Soviet Union and were neutral, but not so friendly with the United States. And they have intermediate range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, and you see about 110 warheads. They have mostly had, at least until recently, a counter-value strategy that have been hit major population centers in the event of nuclear use, which is very different from the US and the Soviet Union. Pakistan probably was assisted by the Chinese. There's always been a rivalry between China and India. And in international relations, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So China's adversary was India. And since Pakistan was an adversary of India, China fostered relations with Pakistan and vice versa. And they remained quite close all these decades. But nothing happened for a long time, 20 some odd years, until May of 1998, just 20 years ago, when India detonated a nuclear device in May of 1998. And within a week or so later, Pakistan detonated a nuclear device. And they both declared themselves as nuclear weapon states. Remember, neither had signed the NPT. They're not in violation of the NPT. There was hope that they wouldn't become nuclear weapon states. So these are two major additions to the nuclear club. Top 5, in Israel, special case, 6, and now India and Pakistan, 8. And Pakistan has had much more of an emphasis on counter-force strategy than counter-value strategy. And I think, by the way, a number of American experts tend to believe the Pakistani systems are much more capable than the Indian systems. There's a scenario that has been of great concern in Washington for a number of years. And for a while, it looked like what we've just seen the last couple of weeks was being played out in real time. Some of you may know that there have been some major Pakistani induced terrorist attacks in India. There was a major attack several years ago where a hotel was sort of invaded by terrorists and they killed a lot of women and children. And the Indian government was persuaded by the United States not to retaliate. The scenario that's of concern is that there's another terrorist attack. And this time India does respond with some limited strikes at the terrorist camps in Pakistan. But that in order to constrain them, the attacks might involve some conventional forces that go into Pakistani territory, Indian conventional forces that go into Pakistani territory. And what follows then is that Pakistan, which has lost 3 wars to India, conventional wars, feeling it cannot defeat India in another conventional war, actually uses some of Pakistan's own nuclear weapons on Pakistani territory to destroy the Indian forces. And that then triggers a major Indian counter-response, which leads to thermonuclear exchange. So what's happened in this most recent case here was there was a terrorist attack. It's definitely attributable to a Pakistani funded group. India responded for the first time since, I think, 1971 with aircraft that crossed into Pakistani territory and bombed the terrorist base. But in so doing, the Pakistanis shot down a couple of the aircraft and they had captured one of the Indian pilots. And just in the last few days, Pakistan returned the pilot to India as a gesture of de-escalation of the conflict. But this is a very dangerous, serious situation. You know, I think if you're only casually familiar with nuclear weapons, you think, oh, you know, no one's going to use these things. It's just never say never. And the animosity between Pakistan and India has remained very intense all these decades since 1947. Although the new Prime Minister Khan of Pakistan has said and done things to indicate he really would like to make a change in the relationship. So we'll see. It's a work in progress. But this is a very serious threat to non-proliferation and non-use. Any questions about any of this? Is this all old hat to you, or are you familiar with it? And by the way, in the meantime, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. greatly enhanced its relations with India. And there was a President George W. Bush completed a major nuclear energy agreement with India, providing them with advanced technology to enhance their nuclear energy program. Although it's questionable whether this is permitted under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Although India is not a member, it's a nuclear weapons state. the U.S. shouldn't be enhancing the capabilities of nuclear weapon states. The rationale on the Bush side was it's part of an anti-Chinese strategy. No comments or questions about this? Yes.
What do we know about Pakistani command and control?
Pakistan command and control, that's a very interesting subject. The U.S. has offered a number of times to assist Pakistan in strengthening their command and control, and also to make them resistant from terrorist acquisition of some of these weapons. And to my knowledge, Pakistan has refused the cooperation. And the U.S., I do know something, but it's incomplete. Now we come to our friends also in the news, North Koreans. So they had a program that actually goes back to the 50s, when Kim Il-sung had become the head of North Korea, but it really went into high gear in the 80s. They eventually signed the NPT, but continued on that program in the 90s. Now, in the 90s, when Clinton was president, that was the time I was in the government, and at one point, Clinton went to the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. He never went to North Korea, but he went to the demilitarized zone, and he gave a speech. And the speech included words to the effect that should North Korea attack South Korea with nuclear weapons, it would be a generation before anyone could safely visit North Korea again. This is a very tough nuclear threat to North Korea. But each president, Carter, I'm sorry, from Clinton, did I say Carter? I meant Clinton. From Clinton to George W. Bush to Obama, and now I think even to Trump, each of them have requested a serious look at what the U.S. could do in an attack to disarm North Korea's nuclear weapons. And each time, the Joint Chiefs were asked, do we have high confidence we could get them all? We could be a disarming first strike. And each time, the Joint Chiefs said no. We have no confidence. We don't know where all of them are. They could definitely probably have some that could retaliate. The U.S. has 28,000 troops in South Korea. They could attack many targets in Japan, where we have many troops. They could attack Guam, major U.S. base. And now we believe, just under the Trump era, the last 2 years, they now have ICBMs capable of delivering nuclear weapons to the United States only. So that's why this has become such a key issue. And again, it's been publicized that Trump and Obama had their one meeting for transition, that Obama told Trump that his biggest priority would be North Korea. It's the most dangerous spot among many spots. So they had declared themselves a nuclear weapon state in 2003. Then a nuclear test a few years later. I think they've had 4 or 5 nuclear tests. They have a stockpile, again, shrouded in uncertainty, somewhere in the 20 to 60 nuclear weapon range. They're deployed on ICBMs, intermediate range ballistic missiles, and short range ballistic missiles. They also have mobile delivery vehicles and deeply buried underground silos. So a lot of what Trump's efforts have been about is to get a handle on all of this. And so far, as we know, they were just in Hanoi and no progress was made. Any questions about the North Korean situation? Now, I should mention, or maybe I'll stand up a little bit. Yeah, on the other weapon states. So, you know, people carry around in their back pocket, US, Russia, Britain, France, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, North Korea. That's 9. But it isn't as though others have not expressed interest or tried to develop programs of their own. In the 1970s, US had intelligence that both South Korea and Taiwan had nuclear weapons development programs. And those 2 cases, this is the 1970s, this, I think President Ford was president after Nixon had resigned. Ford sent a senior emissary to both capitals, to both Seoul and to Taipei, and said, if you continue developing these programs, we'll cut off all security assistance, we'll terminate our treaty obligations with you, the economic sanctions will really be tough. And each of those 2 cases, South Korea and Taiwan, stopped their programs. South Africa, totally different case. South Africa had a weapons development program, and they, I think, used laser enrichment. But then as the Africana apartheid regime began to collapse, they felt that probably the time would come when it would be an all black or black run country. And the Afrikaners did not want the black population to have access to these weapons. So they destroyed all their capability. So that's a very strange, unique example. They had really gone very far. I don't know actually if they had deliverable weapons or not. It may be in the literature. But whatever they had, they destroyed. And then Mandela came out of prison and was a rogue figure, and they became apartheid ended. Ukraine and Belarus, they had nuclear weapons on their soil when the Soviet Union collapsed. So when Russia became an independent state, and there were 14 other independent states, the nuclear weapons of Ukraine and Belarus. Ukraine wanted guarantees from the US about its own security, fearful of the Russians. And there was a treaty signed among the US, Britain, and Russia, guaranteeing that if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, they would have economic assistance, energy assistance, they'd be in great shape. So later on, when Putin ordered the taking of Crimea, which is part of Ukraine, and then moving into eastern Ukraine, that's a violation of that treaty. Belarus just gave up its weapons. They weren't manned. Italy and Sweden and Switzerland also looked into programs, but I don't think they went too far. And there were several other Western European states also. So this has been an effort to keep the lid on, but slowly but surely the numbers are increasing. Now, you have to decide yourself whether this does imply the increased likelihood of use or not. So I wanted to make sure you had just the empirical basis on the nuclear proliferation situation. Any other questions about this? Okay. Now, if you read Narang, Bipin Narang, I asked you to read part of his book. He not only talks a lot about these countries, which is more in the latter part of the book, but he has his own theory about how these weapons would be used by so-called regional powers. And his basic argument is that, you know, unlike the US and the Soviet Union and Russia, or maybe even the French and the British, who are talking about nuclear weapon, threats of nuclear weapon use to deter nuclear attack. But some of these countries are concerned with deterring conventional attack. And he has these 3 categories: catalytic posture, assured retaliation posture, and asymmetric escalation posture. The catalytic posture is really, again, it's a very sort of unusual case where a country is developing nuclear weapons or getting close to using them to bring in some other country to protect them. And the case there does deal with Israel. In the 1973 war, Israel was the victim of a surprise attack by the Egyptians and the Syrians. And both the Egyptians broke through, and the Syrians were on the verge of breaking through into central Israel. And the defense minister of Israel at one point, Moshe Dayan, became a very famous speaker, had a pack show with him. Moshe Dayan went to the prime minister, Golda Meir, and said, I want your permission to get our nuclear weapons ready to be delivered. Because he said, we are witnessing the destruction of the third temple. Now, in Jewish history, the Jews twice had societies, and they were destroyed in ancient times, 2 temples. So he was now making an analogy that in 1973, third temple, which was the state of Israel, was about to be destroyed, about to be overrun. And Golda Meir listened, and she said, I don't approve, I don't give you approval, I'll call Henry. That's Henry Kissinger, who was National Security Advisor to Nixon at the time. And Kissinger said, just hold on, and we'll get you resupplied, and we'll make sure that nobody intervenes, the Russians don't intervene, and we have to just hold on. Going back, this is a coincidence, an anecdote. I was helping run a research center at Harvard in the late 70s, and we had a visitor who was a former Israeli general named Janusz Ben-Gal. And Janusz Ben-Gal commanded all Israeli forces in the north that were holding off Syrians. And the Syrians had 2 divisions, and the Israelis had 1 brigade. And they were able to hold them off for several days. And he became a great national hero. So Israel at that time, the government really thought their life was on the line here. But even then, they chose not to use nuclear weapons. But they would be in this category, according to Ibn Aram, of catalytic posture. The assured retaliation posture is a second strike capability, again, to deter a nuclear attack. And so this is more the classical, like US-Russian case, and India and China are also considered examples of the assured retaliation posture. And then the final one, the asymmetric escalation posture, is to actually develop first use of nuclear weapons in the event of a conventional attack. So this would be like the Pakistan-India example I explained. India attacks with conventional forces, and Pakistan uses nuclear weapons to respond. So there's quite a lot of material. A lot of the language in the book is very political sciencey, so it may not be so comfortable for some of you engineer types. But do look at the flow chart on page 53 that has combines all of the main features of regional nuclear power strategy, catalytic, asymmetric escalation, and assured retaliation. One final point I'll make, and then we'll quit, and that is when going through deterrence, I failed to discuss briefly compellence. Compellence is a term that was developed by Tom Schelling, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for strategy. And a great example of compellence, which is to stop someone from doing something they're already doing, as opposed to stopping somebody from doing something they're about to do, which is deterrence, is in the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. Threatened to retaliate against the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union used its nuclear weapons anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. That's deterrence. At the same time, it had a new naval blockade around Cuba, so we want your missiles out. So that's compellence. That's compelling the Soviets to withdraw their missiles from Cuba. That's an important distinction. Compellence is much more difficult to achieve than deterrence. Okay, that's it for today. See you.
Everyone, just be aware, if you didn't see it on B courses, next Monday we have the in-class project discussions, so you need to organize to meet with your groups to prepare for that.